Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So we took a week off, and now we are back with a very special topic, and it's been one that recently has taken on even greater import. To me, I've been thinking about these issues using field experiments in this area for quite a long time, so I was really tickled that we could bring together such great speakers today. I hope everyone's safe and healthy, and I want to turn it over to Rob to give the introduction to the very first talk today.
Yeah, thanks, John. And good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So today we have three speakers or three papers. The first is by Patrick Patton from Tulane University. Patrick's work is in the area of labor market discrimination and thinking about how policies affect labor market decisions. Secondly, we have David Schwegman from American University. David's research is also in discrimination and thinking about the economics of education. And then lastly, we have Sandra Maximiano from Lisbon School of Economics. And Sandra's work has been in sort of behavioral and experimental economics, and now thinking about discrimination. They also have their co-authors on the panel, so they'll be able to answer any questions that you put into the Q&A. So without further ado, I'll introduce Patrick Patton for the first talk. Thank you, Patrick. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
And there we go. Okay. Hello, Patrick Patton here from Tulane University. Very pleased to be here. Thank you so much. This is co-authored work with a great team of junior researchers. So really excited to present our early work on a pilot study of discrimination against trans and non-binary people and racial and ethnic minorities and access to mental health care. So just some definitions to start. Apologies to those of you who know this. So transgender is someone who, it's sort of an umbrella term for people who have a gender identity that does not necessarily match what they were assigned at birth. So you can usually think of people that being assigned male or female at birth, and then having a gender identity does not match with that. So those are people that are called transgender. Transgender is an umbrella term, so it also includes people, for example, that are non-binary. Non-binary is someone who identifies neither as male or female, some combination of both or neither. And that's also sort of an umbrella term. Another term is cisgender, which you may not have heard of. Cisgender basically just means non-transgender. So cisgender would be someone who identifies with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Okay, so our central research question is, do transgender non-binary individuals face discrimination in access to mental health care appointments? So is it harder for them to get appointments, for example? And then we also want to know if this discrimination is moderated by intersectionality, since we see intersectionality with race and ethnicity often being pretty important. And so we have a preliminary pilot study, and our early results are showing that yes, but it seems like the discrimination is primarily just intersectional, so against trans or non-binary people of color. So just a little bit of background really quickly. So trans and non-binary people and LGBTQ people in general face mental health care disparities. So they're more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety, depression, substance misuse, post-traumatic stress disorder. They suffer from minority stress. And they also face discrimination in access to, or at least perceived discrimination access to primary health care. There's some evidence of audit studies that have done experiments to look at discrimination access to employment, housing, and there's some other sort of anecdotal evidence of discrimination and stigma that trans people face. And this seems to be worse for trans people of color. In terms of the previous literature, what do we know about discrimination access to mental health care or therapy appointments? We really don't know too much. There's some literature on discrimination access to primary care. So there's been a couple of these audit field experiments where they have appointment requests and they vary the socioeconomic status or the insurance status or the race, ethnicity, or gender of people asking for primary care appointments. So there's some evidence of discrimination based on socioeconomic status, insurance status, race, ethnicity, and gender in access to primary care appointments. But for mental health care or therapy appointments, there's really not much evidence. There's three very small scale prior studies that were sort of even smaller than our pilot study. And they provide a little bit of evidence that there might be some race and socioeconomic status discrimination. But other than that, we don't really have a lot of evidence as to what extent there's discriminatory barriers in access to mental health care. And that's important because given that trans people and other minorities face these healthcare disparities, therapy is something that could help treat those conditions, but discrimination in access is going to create a friction in the ability for the mental health care system to help address these mental health care disparities. So how do we design our pilot study? So in this pilot study, we're doing an audit field experiment where we're going to be emailing mental health providers, MHPs as we call them for short. We're going to be emailing them from fictitious prospective patients who are going to email them appointment requests, so asking for a preliminary appointment. So our prospective patients.
Patrick,
Yeah?
sorry, just a quick question.
Yeah.
What is the prevalence of this population, say in America or the world? What are the best estimates of how many people are falling into?
That's a great question. So I don't have the numbers directly in front of me. From what I remember from a forthcoming paper by Lee Badgett, is that she estimated from some data that it was between 0.5 percentage point and 1% of people identify as transgender or non-binary or somewhere on the transgender spectrum.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's larger than what I anticipated, so thanks.
Yeah, it definitely depends on how you define the group, but because transgender is sort of a broad category, a lot of people definitely fall into that categorization. Yeah, great question. So what are our prospective patients? So we're going to signal race, ethnicity, and gender through first names and last names. And we're also going to be signaling that someone is transgender or non-binary. We're doing that, you'll see an example shortly, but we're doing that through an extra statement such as, I'm a transgender woman, I'm looking for a therapist who's trans friendly. We think that's an appropriate way to signal for trans status because when you're looking for a therapist, it's a very personal connection. And so you want to have a therapist who's not going to stigmatize you. And there's a lot of research and sort of anecdotal discussion around how if you're LGBTQ, you definitely want to mention that when you're looking for a therapist so you can try to find a better match. So we don't think it's that unusual of a signal. In terms of the mental health care professionals, the MHPs that we're sampling, we're using Psychology Today's Find a Therapist database. So I personally use this myself to find a therapist. It's a huge database. It has over 200,000 therapists on it. And you can search based on different criteria. They have detailed profiles. We're focusing on therapists that work with adults that treat common issues. That's almost all therapists. We basically just exclude those who are like super focused on, say, grief therapy or couples therapy or sort of specialized groups. And our sample is fairly nationally representative. Yeah.
Patrick, so thanks. Quick question. So, no, can you go back to the other slide?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So if I did an experiment where I had people in an email say, I'm a straight woman and I'm looking for a therapist who is straight, would that cause the level of matches to go down or stay the same?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So you might think of the control group as also wanting to mention like I'm cisgender, but it's typically not common that people would mention that they're cisgender, generally because they don't have to worry about having someone who's like cisgender friendly. So we thought about that, but it would be very, very unusual for someone to mention I'm straight or I'm cisgender or I'm white or something like that. And so our control group are people who are presumed cisgender because they're not mentioning that they're trans or non-binary. And we think it would be very not externally valid for them to mention I'm cisgender and I'm looking for someone who's cisgender friendly. But that's a good point. And I mean, that's a consideration.
I worry about it because if these types of questions signal the person's just going to be difficult to work with, regardless of how they define themselves, then it feels like you might get an overestimate of the level of discrimination because the person seems too demanding or unruly.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it could be seen as like a little bit extra because you're disclosing this sort of extra part about yourself. And I mean, that comes with being transgender and non-binary, where those people could have more difficult to, concerns to treat. So I think it's sort of externally valid for them to mention that. But I do think that's a good point. So one thing we'll think about is there another way that we could have a control group say mention something that might make them seem like they're more difficult patients, but then is more externally valid. So that's something that I'm gonna look into more, and that actually has some parallels with the literature as well. So maybe I'll follow up on that point. That's
okay. Super. Really thanks, Patrick. Thanks.
Yeah. So that's really helpful too, because we always want to think about how externally valid our signals are. And that's really hard to do with LGBTQ studies. We think we're doing better, but there's ways to improve. So we have 1,000 of these therapists, and we're sending them one email from a prospective patient who varies by race, ethnicity, or gender. Here's just what the Psychology Today website looks like. There's tons of information that we will eventually scrape and harvest to do extra analysis. We don't have that yet, but these databases are really, really detailed, so it's quite helpful. So randomizing our patients as follows. So 1 out of 8 are going to be trans women, 1 out of 8 are trans men, 1 out of 4 are non-binary, and 1/4 are cisgender women, and 1/4 are cisgender men. So the way that we signal trans women, trans men, and non-binary is a statement like, I'm non-binary and I'm looking for a trans-friendly therapist. And the people that don't mention gender identity are presumed to be cisgender. Independently of gender identity, we assign 1/4 of the sample to be Black via African-American names, and 1/4 of them are Hispanic via Hispanic names, and then the other half are white via white-sounding names. There's a common concern in the literature with using names to signal race and ethnicity. Really, really quickly, we try to build on the literature by using names that have different SES, socioeconomic status signals. So there's some work that shows that, for example, different names are associated with different parental levels of education. So we do vary the SES signal of the first name that we use to signal race and ethnicity. It's not going to be a perfect way to control for SES signals with names, but it's significantly better than what we've seen in the prior literature. And how our emails look is, here's sort of the general structure of it, and then I'll show you an example. So basically, here's where we slot in our randomized components, such as a name with signals gender, race, or ethnicity. And then we also have this extra statement where if they're trans or non-binary, they say, I am a trans woman or a trans man, and I'm looking for a therapist who is trans-friendly. So this is an example of what the email looks like. It's relatively simple. And we wanted to keep the email simple because we think that when people typically email therapists, they're going to keep the email fairly simple. So we thought this was fairly externally valid. So in terms of how we code up these responses, we get responses back from the mental health professionals either through a reply email or through a voicemail or sometimes via text message. And then we take all those responses and we categorize them. So this is our detailed categorization of the outcomes. So what we've got here is appointment. So they offered an appointment outright. That happens one out of 3 times. A call or consultation is where they're offering to talk to you on the phone to try to figure out if an appointment makes sense. So it's not quite an appointment, but it's closer to that. Screening question is where they didn't offer any sort of appointment, but they asked a question like, what's your insurance status? Waitlist means they mention you're on a wait list. There's referral, rejection. No voicemail is just one weird case. And then no response happens 25% of the time where they don't even respond to their request at all. So in terms of the detailed categorization, for now, we're going to be collapsed into a primary outcome where it equals 1 for an appointment or a call or consultation offer. So those are sort of the best possible outcomes that are most indicative of being able to get an appointment. So we have a binary variable equal to 1 for appointment or call/consultation. And so the results I'm going to show you are going to be using that characterization, and then we're going to be doing some more robustness checks later.
So, Patrick,
so these are, yes?
Hi, excuse me. So the Q&A is going nuts, and I appreciate the responses to that, but I wanted to bring up just a general tenor, I think, with all field experiments and what's coming up on the Q&A revolves around the theory that you have in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think about Gary's theory from 1957, where people are deriving utility from hurting another group. He called it bigotry, whatever, a taste for discrimination. You have what Pagoo called third-degree price discrimination. Mm-hmm. It's become statistical discrimination. Phelps talked about that, etc. Could you kind of paint the picture of what you think is going on if it's statistical discrimination versus taste-based discrimination, and how your data might be able to point in certain directions and give us hints about which of the, if you do find discrimination, which of those theories you think is at work?
Yeah, so really quickly, and I apologize, didn't have much of this in the slides given the time. We are going to be doing some testing for that. I think that's fundamental. So the ways that we're going to try to test for taste versus statistical. So one way we can test for taste-based discrimination is to see if the discrimination we observe is correlated with anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ attitudes. So we can get data at the county level from the General Social Survey and see, kind of like in a Charles and Gurian approach, see if discrimination is related to that kind of animus. We can also study some statistical discrimination. So for example, in the next wave of this experiment, we are going to be either randomly disclose or not disclose an insurance status. And so the MHP might have perceptions that gender minorities or racial minorities might have worse healthcare like Medicaid. There's a lot of evidence that therapists do not like Medicaid. And so if they make assumptions about insurance status, we can test for that kind of statistical discrimination. So those are just two examples. Happy to discuss further.
Yeah, good. I know that one person, it might have been Simeon, I can't remember, I can't see the name, but said that maybe the statement that you used signaled that there might be a lot of future business, or it might be easier for therapies to be used in the future in a dynamic way. That's another way to think about statistical discrimination, is that what are the future profit flows from this person?
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think I've got a couple more minutes. I'm just going to quickly wrap up with the results here. So this is a real summer pilot. So these are just the appointment or caller consultation offer rates just by these groups. It's just a sort of a raw tabulation. So you can see quickly here is that there is a little bit of a difference between, there's a decent amount of difference between those who are cisgender or transgender, but generally the difference comes mostly from those who are trans or non-binary people of color. So we see the biggest differences here looking at trans and non-binary Hispanics and trans and non-binary African Americans. If we take this and put it into a simple linear probability model, and the results are similar to Probit of this form here, which is just going to match the earlier results, we're going to get basically the same sort of results here. So here we're just running a simple regression with indicator variables for are you trans or non-binary, non-binary African American Hispanic, trans or non-binary times African American, trans and non-binary times Hispanic, and then some state fixed effects. And the results are fairly similar. So just so you can kind of gauge these coefficients, the appointment offer rate for cisgender white people is 61.3%. So these are fairly large differences. But what's interesting is that we don't really see discrimination against trans and non-binary people in general. So white people that are trans and non-binary don't seem to be facing discrimination. Where we do see it is in these interactions. So it's trans people of color. We're seeing intersectional discrimination, particularly against African Americans who are trans and non-binary. We're also seeing some discrimination against people that are non-binary, just regardless of their race and ethnicity. So we're going to probe that a little bit more. Our results are similar to Probe, but these are sort of very, very early results. So we only just finished this pilot study. So we're looking to continue this. And so being able to present here to get early feedback is super crucial, because once you do a field experiment, as many of you know, you can't go back and change things despite what the editor or referees want. So this kind of feedback is helpful. So what we're doing right now is that we're going to be in the next wave of data collection, adding insurance status. We might look at sexual orientation as well. We're going to be looking at people with Chinese names, given the increase in discrimination against Chinese people. And then we're going to be doing additional primary analysis, looking at different outcome variables, additional secondary analysis, like what John and I just discussed around testing for statistical versus taste-based discrimination, other moderators of discrimination. One other extension we have in mind is that this experiment has been collecting data during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we're interested in seeing how this pandemic is affecting access to mental health care appointments. And given the increased demand for mental health care, we could be seeing that the mental health care system is having difficulty keeping up with the excess demand. So we can actually test that in an audit field experiment framework. So this is sort of a silver lining of an extremely unfortunate situation. So we're looking to do some work on that as well, and look at also how COVID-related policies like stay-at-home mandates are affecting access to mental health care. So we'd love to, in next steps, incorporate any kind of feedback you give us. Thank you so much for your thoughts and questions so far. We're going to file a pre-analysis plan in around a month or so, and then run the experiment starting in the fall and into the spring, collecting more data to keep this project going. So thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to send me any emails with any ideas or ask me any other questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Patrick. That was great. And if you want to keep on asking questions to Patrick for the first paper, feel free to put just number 1 by your Q&A so that we know it's about the first paper rather than the second paper coming up by David. One thing I wanted to mention, Patrick, was the recent paper by Judd Kessler et al. On discrimination on using resumes. They have the case of looking at MBAs in Wharton, and then seeing those on the demand side, getting their preferences about what type of, I'd say, patients or employees that they want, and then they actually have the real people in the background to match them with. I'm wondering, is that a potential avenue that you can go down, where you might have a potential pool of individuals who might want therapy, and you can actually get incentive compatible responses from the demand side?
It's possible. It would be tricky in terms of getting the kind of grant funding to do that, because when you hire people, it's quite expensive. I mean, it's possible. We would have to recruit from sort of select populations to make sure we don't want people pretending to be trans or non-binary when they actually aren't. So it's certainly possible. It's something to consider. And I think that would be nice, because with these sort of audit field experiments, the appointment offer via email is, strongly correlated with access to mental health care, but it's not perfectly. And so I agree that that would be useful. So something to definitely consider. Tricky, but there's benefits to it for sure.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Okay, so we move on to the next paper by David Schwegman on do foster care agencies discriminate against gay couples, evidence from a correspondence study. So David, if you could share your screen, or Patrick, you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh, yes, sorry.
And we'll have Matty, Mackenzie, Lou will be answering any questions that you have during David's talk.
Sorry, good job, Patrick. Just trying to, where did my, problem of having too many things open at once. Okay. Let's see. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Oops, let me go up. Sorry. Thank you so much, Patrick. Good job with that. And thanks to John and Robert for organizing this. Really looking forward to the feedback. Let me get this into the screen. Okay. Great. So thank you so much for coming today. So this is a joint paper with Maddie Mackenzie Liu, who is a PhD candidate at Syracuse University, and Len Lopo, who's a professor at Syracuse. We did this back when I just finished my PhD and joined the faculty at American. So we did this right at the close of my PhD. It was one of the sort of joyful takeaways as the world started to shut down. And what we do in this paper is we examine the experimental field study where we test if representatives from child welfare agencies discriminate against gay and lesbian couples. Pretty similar design to what Patrick just sort of outlined for you. We pose as an inquiring couple, where we use names to signal like same gender names or opposite gender names to signal the sexual orientation of the inquiring couple. And we pose as an inquiring couple. We sent 2 emails to 1,147 foster care agencies throughout the United States inquiring about sort of the process of becoming a foster care parent. And we only use Caucasian names, so it's just looking at sexual orientation discrimination. We were worried about having sufficient power to explore any other type of identity elements. And what we find is that foster care agencies are slightly less likely to respond, not statistically significantly different to same-sex male couples. But what they do when they respond, they provide shorter and less detailed responses to same-sex male couples relative to either heterosexual couples or same-sex female couples. And we actually find no evidence of differential treatment towards same-sex female couples, suggesting that gender is playing, it's not just sexual orientation, but gender is playing, or gender discrimination is a barrier in access to foster care, in the ability for either children to be placed into same-sex male couples' homes, or for sort of this pathway for family formation to be available to certain members of the LGBTQ community. So just sort of background, foster care in the United States is the full-time temporary care for children who are removed from a home and for whom the state has placement and care responsibilities. The median time spent in foster care, although it's designed to be temporary, the median time spent in foster care is about over a year, 14.7 months. And it's an interesting social service because it is provided by private citizens. Foster care agencies recruit and certify foster care parents in the United States and help to place children in their homes, but it's ultimately a service that's actually provided by private citizens. And
David,
sure.
I'm sorry, quick question.
Yeah.
What do we know about the outcomes of children from foster agencies to same-sex couples versus, whether they're 2 men, 2 women, or a man and a woman? What do we know about the child outcomes in those cases?
Very little. So we know almost nothing about the outcomes for children who are fostered by same-sex couples relative to heterosexual couples, what we know is that there is no evidence that children raised by same-sex male, same-sex female couples or differ in any way in terms of educational outcomes, in terms of health outcomes, mental health, or physical health, educational attainment, or labor market opportunities compared to heterosexual couples.
Okay,
So
great.
one
That's
of these,
awesome.
yeah.
That's awesome.
Right, perfect. And the sort of the politics of who can become a foster parent have actually been at the center of a lot of debates in recent years. So last year, in November of last year, the Trump administration and the Department of Health and Human Services proposed a new rule that would allow faith-based agencies to refuse to work with same-sex couples if doing so conflicted with deeply held religious beliefs. So this is sort of the religious protection laws that have operated, have been imposed, have been implemented on a state-by-state basis throughout the United States in the past 5 years. And it's also been at the question of who can become a foster parent has also been litigated in recent years. So the Supreme Court will hear a case in their coming term, in the October 2020 term, where a faith-based not-for-profit in Philadelphia sued the city of Philadelphia over their anti-discrimination clause in their contracting provision. So this is sort of the question of religious, these religious freedom laws. The not-for-profit wants to refuse to work with same-sex couples, and Philadelphia is saying that they can't, so they weren't allowed to participate in the service, and that's what the Supreme Court will consider this coming term. So we think that this actual question is sort of an interesting one to explore at the moment. Historically, foster care had been provided, it had exclusively been provided by public agencies in the United States. So departments of social services have historically been the ones to provide foster care services, beginning really under the Bush 1 administration, or Bush 2 administration, the George W. Bush administration. There began to be a lot of not-for-profits that entered the scene. Many of these were religiously affiliated not-for-profits who provided either fee-based services or were able to obtain contracts from states to begin to provide foster care services. And their primary objective is to recruit foster care parents, certify these parents, verify that the homes for these foster care parents are able to provide safe and adequate home environments for children, and then ultimately place children in the care of these certified parents. And in the United States, so it varies, the exact process, like many things in the United States, will vary state by state, but there's sort of a general archetypal process of how someone becomes a foster care parent in the United States. In this study, we're really, like many audit studies, these correspondence studies, we're really only able to say something sort of truly true and definitive about the initial context stage, how someone, if any differential treatment in terms of sort of right at the very beginning of this process of whether or not this agency is willing to engage with the inquiring couple. But this process is actually this multi-step process that begins with first contact. Begins at sort of this first contact point where a foster parent will express interest, or foster parents or parent can express interest in becoming certified. They go through sort of an initial information, they go to an initial information session where they learn about the actual longer process of becoming a foster parent. They'll submit some type of application either to the agency and or the state. Then they'll go through some type of pre-training or pre-service training, which can be quite extensive. There's ultimately a home assessment to make sure that the home environment is safe for the child. Then they'll be certified. Once they're certified, then they can foster children. So we're only really going to be able to say something true and definitive about this first contact stage. But what we're ultimately going to do, so this is the sort of primary research question, is do same-sex and heterosexual couples who inquire about foster parents receive the same treatment in terms of responses? But what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at the content of the responses to see if they provide, sort of the quality of these responses vary, and the informational content of the responses can actually provide some insights into to what extent the SCAs may help to facilitate a foster parent along the process of becoming a certified parent, foster parent.
Hi, Patrick. Quick question. So do you have any data on what the funnel looks like? And in particular, if 100 people go to the information session, how many of those 100 people end up with a child? And does that differ across same-sex and heterosexual couples?
Very little. So the primary data source, for foster care is AFGARS, which is all about child placements. Post-placement, not really, there's no, to my knowledge, with the exception of some small qualitative studies, there's no real evidence or information on interest, which would have to be collected at the local, at sort of the agency level, and there's no, to my knowledge, state that requires agencies to report that information centrally, or sort of attrition overall. My guess is, based off of sort of qualitative evidence, there's a lot of parents express, a lot of couples will express interest early on. Degree of attrition, I'm not so, there's going to be extensive attrition early on, but I don't know. So to answer your question, no, there's not a lot of good evidence. Anecdotally, my guess is there's pretty high attrition at this sort of second stage. Once they sort of submit an application, there's probably some selection that keeps people pushing through. But one important thing to emphasize is that these agencies have a lot of discretion over whether or not to certify a parent. So the application can be accepted or rejected, and I don't think that there's a lot of avenues for appeal for couples who feel that their application was mishandled, particularly by a non-public agency.
Yeah, so the reason why I ask those two questions, when you put them together, you have some sort of semblance of trying to understand why there could be differential treatment at first contact. Like, for example, if sexual couples always just drop out at the information session, I want to get more same-sex couples in right away because I know the heterosexuals are just going to drop out, for example.
That's right.
It
Yep.
feels
And
like
one thing we do know is
to
that
make some interpretation of the data.
That's right. One thing I should emphasize is that around 20% of all, it's not questionable. We have limited evidence on the sexual orientation of foster parents, but what we do know is around 1 in 5 married same-sex couples have fostered at some point in their relationship. So where I think it's about 7% of heterosexual couples. So same-sex couples are much more likely to foster. They also are much less likely to have other avenues available to them for family formation. So they're my guess is that the average same-sex couple is more likely to persist through the process than a heterosexual couple. So any discrimination against same-sex couples is probably going to have a greater effect on the supply of foster, despite them being a smaller sort of available pool of parent, may have a more detrimental effect on the discrimination against the average same-sex couple relative to the average heterosexual couple is probably going to have a more disadvantageous effect on the pipeline of available foster homes. Thank you for the question. So the primary outcome measures we're going to look at overall response rates. We're going to look at time to response, which is sort of a measure of agent or agency enthusiasm. And then we're also going to look at word count, which is a measure of agency effort. One caveat, we don't actually know who is responding, whether it's the placement officer, whether it's the front desk person. So really we're going to think about this as the agents or the agency. So the agency official, the person in charge of who has been given a discretion by the agency to respond to these inquiries is the person we're thinking about who's responding. And then what we're going to do, so we're going to take the responses we actually receive from the foster care agencies, and we're going to break down 12 different foster process measures, whether or not they provided information about a session, whether or not they provided information about a session and the date and time of the next session. So I'll break those down and go through them pretty quickly. But I'm happy to provide the preprint of the paper for anyone who wants to read more about those measures. And then we're going to look at sort of more subtle measures of discrimination, so positive language, negative language, greetings, exclamations, things like that, things that actually sort of help to keep interested couples engaged in the process. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. So Patrick covered a lot of this. There's large literature on the discrimination of race and gender and disability, sexual orientation, a variety of contexts. Extensive literature examining discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The existing evidence is largely restricted to the private sector, so looking a lot at employment discrimination, rental market discrimination. There's also some qualitative and mixed method evidence that suggests individuals, same-sex couples face some barriers towards fostering and adopting children. But to our knowledge, this is the first to look at this question using an experimental framework. This group will fully understand the experimental design. We have 1,147 private and public foster care agencies in the United States. We send 2 emails to these agencies 6 weeks apart, randomize the order, use same or opposite gendered names to signal sexual orientation. All foster care agencies will receive an email from a heterosexual couple. They will also receive an email from a same-sex couple. Random assignment to whether it's going to be a same-sex female couple or same-sex male couple. We do keep the design so that if the agency was randomly assigned to receive an email from a same-sex male couple, the sender of the heterosexual couple is the husband. And when they're randomly assigned to receive an email from a same-sex female couple, the sender of the heterosexual email is the wife. So there's not like a gendered sender effect in the inquiries. And then we just measure response rates. So, we collect both the content as well as the time of the responses. Scripts, pretty also straightforward given what Patrick sort of, so we follow similar to what we do in the previous paper. So we randomize names of the husband, or the names of the sender as well as the spouse, signal sexual orientation. We have 2 different scripts that we randomize across, basically say sort of like some type of introduction, some inquiry about becoming a foster parent, some question that we randomize about someone we can speak to about the process or the next steps involved, some randomized closing, and then the first and last name of the sender. Important thing to note, this is both married same-sex couples, married heterosexual couples. So we're not looking at like questions around the longevity of relationships. So if it's like a partnership or boyfriend, wife, or boyfriend, girlfriend, regardless of sexual orientation, this is just looking at married couples. Empirics, I'm going to skip through this, pretty straightforward. No one will have issues understanding this. So at the very top panel, we're looking at response rates. Overall response rates was 54.9%, which I shared the paper with some folks at the Human Rights Campaign. The Human Rights Campaign is a major LGBTQ advocacy group, and they have a process for identifying and certifying foster care agencies who have been known to work well with same-sex couples throughout the United States. And when I shared this with them, they were surprised at the low response rate overall. But they were surprised, but then they went through and they have actually found something fairly consistent anecdotally with the clients that they've worked with in terms of looking at responses. And it's often repeated responses in order to get a response, as well as in-person stops, and phone calls tend to be the thing that actually gets someone in the door. Looking across the 3 major groups, we're not seeing much difference. Heterosexual couples receive a response about 55% of the time. Same-sex female couples are actually most likely to get a response, around almost 60% of the time. And then some preliminary sort of observational notice that same-sex male couples receive the lowest response rates, around 50% of the time. We put this in a regression framework, and all of our regression outcomes will include agency fixed effects. So these are just differences in response rates coming from within the same agency. We see that same-sex male couples receive a response 3.7 percentage points. They're 3.7 percentage points less likely to get a response, but that's not statistically significantly different from 0 relative to heterosexual couples. The same no real difference between same-sex female couples and heterosexual couples either. But what we do start to see is differences in terms of agent enthusiasm. So same-sex male couples wait much longer to receive a response. We're not exactly sure what the underlying processes are, whether or not it's like true enthusiasm or they're just sitting on them longer. But this is where we start to see large differences. And same-sex male couples on average will wait about 122 minutes longer to receive a response relative to a heterosexual couple. No difference between same-sex female couples and heterosexual couples. And then when we start to look at word count, this is where we start to see also stark response differences. So same-sex male couples, not conditional on response, so including like non-responses and responses in the regression outcome. Same-sex male couples are about 20, receive responses with 20 fewer words. And once we condition on responses, so looking at FCAs that responded to both couples, same-sex male couples receive responses that have 43 fewer words. So this translates into about 2 fewer sentences. Okay, so this is where we see sort of the starkest difference in the quality of responses across the major groups. So then the next natural question is, what is missing in these 2 sentences? Are these 2 sentences actually relevant for moving someone along in the foster care process? So what we're going to do is we break down the process of becoming a foster parent into different outcomes or to different process measures. So if you want to know about, to become a foster parent, you have to know about information sessions. So you have to know about an information session. You have to go and attend an information session in order to become a foster parent. So we're going to look at, did they provide information about a foster, about in sort of informational session? Did they provide, so we call that like our session outcome. Did they provide the specific time, date, and location of the next available information session? So we call it a session plus outcome. Did they provide information about an application? Did they provide the application? Did they talk about licensure? So applications are different from licensures. Did they provide their contact information? So did they give you a phone number and ask you to follow up? Did they solicit information? So soliciting information is particularly important for public foster care agencies because public foster care agencies operate within catchment zones. So certain counties serve county residents. So they need to know exactly where you live in order to determine if they're the correct person to provide you services or if a neighboring county is the more appropriate individual. Do they ask to set up an appointment, and do they provide you information on how to set up that appointment? Do they ask to talk by a phone, or do they ask you specific questions? Location, solicits information. Then one of the subcomponents of that, do they actually ask you where you live? Do they mention a home study? A home study is where they go into your home to actually talk about, or to where they go home to actually verify that the environment is safe to foster children. And then do they include any attachments? So attachments were most often applications, brochures, information, like sort of key dates for the upcoming information sessions, things like that. So those are the things we look at. Happy to answer any emails or provide the paper for anyone who wants to read more about those. So we look at each of those measures. We're going to adjust for multiple hypothesis testing because we're looking at 12 different outcomes. So the ones in red boxes are, even after adjusting for multiple hypothesis testing, we're still seeing statistically significant differences. And this is just for gay men relative to heterosexual couples. So what we're finding is that SCAs are much less likely to provide information about information sessions, as well as sort of information sessions plus the date and time of upcoming information sessions to same-sex male couples. This translates into about 7 to 8%. So it's a 10 percentage point difference in terms of information sessions, which translates to about a 7% effect. They're much less likely to provide information about applications. They're much less likely to provide their contact information or solicit contact information, and they're much less likely to provide information, or they're asked to set up appointments. So overall, what we're finding is lower quality responses to same-sex male couples. Relatedly, correspondingly, we find less positive language. I'm happy to talk about positive, but it's what you think about as positive language. For same-sex male couples, no difference for same-sex female couples. And this includes, there's no difference for same-sex female couples in terms of the quality or informational content of the responses either. They're much less likely to include a greeting. They're also much less likely to include an exclamation point, which there's a surprising amount of literature in the communications world on the use of exclamation points. So that was a joyful thing I learned while doing this project. So let me just wrap up because I know we're running out of time. What the results suggest is that same-sex male couples face higher barriers in terms of the process of becoming a foster parent. They're not necessarily less likely to receive a response, but they're much less likely to receive a higher quality response that actually lets them know about what are the next steps involved, which suggests some reticence on the part of the agency to actually help them become a certified foster parent. And this sort of ties into literature within the public administration world on administrative burden, the exact costs imposed on citizens as they attempt to access local public services. Questionable whether you should think about foster care services as the local public service to which they're entitled, but as we delegate government authority to foster care agencies, this is sort of an important framework to thinking about how these ostensibly private citizens are operationalizing and using government power to potentially discriminate against individuals. And then importantly, and I think this is the major point of the paper, is that this has potential implications for child well-being. John's first question when I started talking about this is like, there's no evidence that same-sex male couples provide less stable or less secure homes for children. So what this will just do is sort of exacerbate a chronic shortage of foster care parents, which already exists in the country, and is actually expected to get worse as a result of a 2018 law, the Family First Prevention Services Act, which reduced federal care and or provided less federal funding for congregate care for children, so like foster homes, trying to push children into sort of foster parent homes. So this is likely to even further exacerbate this existing shortage. And also gay youth are overrepresented in the foster care world. So this is even potentially further restricting access to homes that might be best at providing services to LGBTQ youth. And for same-sex couples, this has implications for family formation, fostering. So in the United States, fostering is generally the first step to adopting children. Most frequently, you don't just adopt a child, you foster them first, and fostering is the process to domestic adoption. And actually, our results suggest that potentially there's illegal behavior because what we're finding is it's questionable. It's hard to disentangle gender from sexual orientation, but discriminating against males who are inquiring about becoming foster parents for their maleness as opposed to their sexual orientation is technically illegal under federal law. But I don't know to what extent we won't be able to ever disentangle those two. So thank you so much. Sorry, Robert, if I went over. I don't know. I wasn't.
No, thank you, David. That was great. Just one quick question, similar to what Patrick had at the end of his slides, is where does this work lead to? Are you doing more experiments right now on this area, and how does that info your thinking?
Yeah, no, I think that there's relatively limited evidence for anyone in attending the seminar. There's relatively little evidence at the moment on sexual orientation discrimination, particularly in the private sector. I mean, Patrick and I have done some work on sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in a variety of contexts, but I think the next steps, and I would encourage anyone, I'm happy to talk with anyone about this, is the next steps is looking at how gender, sexual orientation, and race interact. So I have one previous study that looks at public sector discrimination by on the sort of at the intersectionalities of sexual orientation and race. And what I'm finding, which is consistent with the literature in the mental health space and the primary care space, as well as in the sort of more sociological literature on intersectionality, is that same-sex male or same-sex male couples or gay men of color are much less likely to be able to obtain high-quality public services, and they're much more likely to face intersectional forms of discrimination, so not just discrimination, sort of exacerbatory discrimination, not just racism, structural racism and structural homophobia, but structural racism within the gay community and structural homophobia within their own individual minority communities. So that's, I think, a very fruitful space to both document existing discrimination as well as to test interventions or pathways or legal avenues to ameliorate and reduce that discrimination. So would love to, if anyone's interested in those questions, would love to chat more. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And that leads nicely on to Sandra's talk about is the rental market gay friendly, evidence from our field experiment. So Sandra, over to you. Sandra, I think you're mute.
Yep.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay. So this is a joint work with João Pereira de Santos, that is with us today, and Tiago and Patricia. They are all PhD candidates from Nova University, which is another economics or another business school in Lisbon as well. So basically what I'm presenting today is actually looking at discrimination against those in same-sex relationships in the rental market. And we are focusing on only male and not on lesbian relationships, but only on same-sex male relationships. We try to disentangle between pure discrimination and statistical discrimination. It was mentioned today. It is a difficult task to do, and we tried, and we will see. This is an ongoing project. We also hope to extend to other sorts of discriminations and look at more interactions between same-sex relationships and other sorts of discriminations as well. So any suggestions will be welcome. So basically we use a field experiment where we send 4 different emails to each landlord, which vary in 2 dimensions. Short versus long emails and sexual orientation. heterosexual versus homosexual couple, which basically vary on the name. It will be more on their first and last names, and it will be clear in a few slides. So we basically randomly select 373 properties in Lisbon, still focus in Lisbon. As I said, this we hope to extend to other places in the country. Our expectation is also that Lisbon, if there is some discrimination, probably Lisbon will be less than in other places. Also, it's more difficult to get, let's say, more data on rentals in other places rather than in Lisbon. So that's why we first focus on the capital and its suburban areas. So we use a Portuguese housing rental site. So just the main results, a big like overview. Our aggregate data shows no significant discrimination. However, when the analysis is done separately for below and above median rent prices, we find opposite results. And we find a sort of positive discrimination for one group and negative discrimination for another, and we will see what sort of discrimination. So just
Sandra, hi Sandra. Quick question. So what do we know about the differences in homosexual and heterosexual couples in terms of breaking leases, abusing property, not fulfilling the month-to-month payments that they should be making? Like anything along the lines of value of this type of renter? What do we know about that, Sandra?
So we know very little, almost nothing actually. So that's a good point. And one thing we want to proceed with this project is going to be with some sort of survey questions to some landlords and also real estate agencies. I have been doing more an informal sort of surveying some real estate agents and whether they have some complaints along these lines, but there's very little is known about that. So that's something that we need definitely to look at. That's a good point. So there is some literature quite some literature that actually documents discrimination based on race, gender, sex, disability, and variety of contexts. A little bit less on rental market or housing market in general. So one more recent paper is from David Schwegman, that is with us today. And they report that homosexual couples, especially non-white same-sexual male couples, are less likely to receive a reply to inquiries about property. So actually there is some report on some actual discrimination. The same if we look at the Swedish housing market. As I said, with our data, we don't see, like upfront, we don't see any sort of discrimination against gay couples, but only when we differentiate in terms of rent. So let's just give you a brief overview about the rental market in Portugal, but it's kind of a sui generis market, I would say. So during, let's say, what we call Estado Novo, which is our dictatorship period, one of the longest, is actually the longest in history in Europe, we had rent control in the cities. Not only rent control, but we also had a very large number of programs that were meant to provide affordable houses to people that move from the countryside to the city. This rent control was generalized to all country. In the 70s, 74, it was when we had the revolution, so basically the end of this dictatorship period, but the rent control was generalized to all country. I must say that before, the rent control was never a big problem because inflation was pretty low, but then it became quite of a problem. So since 1985, there is a gradual abandonment of rent controls in Portugal. It has been going very, very slow. We were supposed to have it completely done by this year, and due to COVID, was again postponed to 22. So it's really gradual. It has been a gradual process. And just to give you a sense of how this rent control is, there are still some apartments in Lisbon that have rents as cheap as like €5, while most of people now are paying on average €1,000. So it's really a big difference. So in 2011, the Portuguese economy suffered from global recession and years of austerity policy, and received an international bailout of 78 billion from the European Union and IMF. In 2012, Portugal's government set up a golden visa scheme, and this is quite important for also for the housing market, through foreign investors. So this foreign investors could gain a temporary residency permit in exchange for investment. So by far the most popular means to do so was to purchase at least $500,000 of real estate. More than 9,000 golden visas have been granted to date, more than 90% of them for real estate. So the new rental law that liberalized the housing market, increasing tourism, and the golden visa combined with also this non-habitual residence program that gives tax benefits to people that return to their own country, created a housing bubble. So also we have this tourism boom since 2014, and also an online registration license to list properties on hosting platforms. There was a huge increase on houses on these hosting platforms. House prices in Lisbon rose enormously, like 35% from 2012 to 2016. Just like average rental prices increased 37% in 2018 compared to 2017, and it's just basically 1 year increase. Some rents increasing more than eightfold, from 60 to 1,000 a month in few years. And just for you to see the problem, in 2017, thousands have been evicted from their homes on average of nearly 6 families a day, just because people wanted to post their houses on these hosting platforms, or obviously trying to get some updates in the more liberalized rental market. In 2018, Lisbon implemented a ban of new rental registries in November. And all this experiment occurred before that. So there has been big changes, and also with COVID, but I must say that there's some data after in terms of houses prices and rental prices, and since COVID, and they only affected apartments, like small apartments like T1, all the others, the prices are still very high. So, and just to tell you a little bit about LGBT rights in Portugal, same-sex sexual activity was first decriminalized in 1852, so long ago, but it was made a crime again in 1886, so just for historical, little bit historical background. And Portugal became quite more oppressive of homosexuals until and throughout the dictatorship years, as kind of expected. But in 1982, same-sexual activity was decriminalized. Portugal has a wide-ranging anti-discrimination laws, and is one of the few countries in the world to contain a ban on discrimination based on sexual orientation in its constitution. So in 2010, the state became the 8th in the world to recognize same-sex marriage. And in 2011, the president ratified the law of gender identity, which simplifies also the process of sex and name change for transgender people. And same-sex adoption has been legal since 2016. So this is just a bit of a background. So now experimental design. So we have these 4 fictitious couples, 2 gay couple and 2 heterosexual. Most common names and surnames in Portugal, so it's basically what we use. For example, Maria and João, or João and Fernando. This is very, very common names, and this is the sort of names we used. First names are very indicative of your, let's say, gender identity too. Two mail templates. We use a short versus long, and with that we try to go a bit deeper into the statistical discrimination. So the short email basically has this sentence: good morning, we saw your online post and we are interested in the house for a couple in Lisbon or in Cascais, which is a suburban area. Thank you, and a signature. Or the long email: good morning, we are a couple looking for a house. We are interested in the announcement, that you publish in IMO-Virtual, which is the online platform we used. I am 31 years old and I'm an IT technician, and my my partner's name is 30 years old, something along these lines. He or she is a marketing director. We do not have children nor pets. We do not smoke, and we have reference from the previous landlord. Thank you. So this long email, we kind of vary some details, some variables in this email, but on average, we try to keep, let's say, the quality level the same. So the profession, we use professions like a doctor, IT technician, or a lawyer, though on average, they are more or less equal paid, professions that are more or less equal paid in Portugal. Was important to refer that the children, not having children nor pets, and also we sort of randomize the order that these characteristics appeared in the email. Each landlord received 4 messages with 15 minutes interval. And as I said, randomizing some details and the order of details was important because of the time span of the message sent. The order and the email that was used is randomized. We didn't have big problems with that, and apparently no, it seems that no people blocked or complained about any emails or kind of suspected that this was an experiment. At least is the feeling we have. So we used one of the largest sites, online sites in Portugal, this IMO-Virtual. Firms and individual landlords announce for free their properties for sale and rent in this site. Paying allows properties to appear in the top of a search. And tenants can do a customized search for a city, type of landlord, firms versus individual, and several property features. So these sort of features and the type of landlord, and so everything that we could get from the website, we also used as controls in our regressions. Tenants have the option to contact the landlord on the announcement page. So the experiment was conducted between March and October 2018. Then we had this ban on hosting properties for hosting platforms like Airbnb in Lisbon. So there will be probably some impact as well on this rental market, and that's something we are also going to explore. We have 5 regions covered in Lisbon and Setúbal district, so it's the south side of Lisbon. So so basically, they are the regions we used. And as you can see, there's some differences in prices, being Cascais and Oeiras close to Lisbon, the highest in price, Lisbon area. This is an average price for 86 square meters, and Cascais, a little bit bigger properties, but also more expensive. So the prices, the variance in prices were not so high, and the area as well not so high. So we use basically difference in difference model. We did some, look at some different outcome variables to look at not only like this direct, as was mentioned in previous presentations, not only this direct discrimination, but also this more subtle type of discrimination. So whether the potential renters receive an answer or not, an invitation or not to see an apartment or a house, number of characters, that shows also is more interest in the couple or not, and whether the landlord insisted in resending an email by asking whether a person is still in, or the couple is still interested or not. Controls, we have region, fixed effects, area, and rent. We also have property owner fixed effects, and the standard errors were clustered at property owner level. So if you look just basically at the answer rate, and we can see that having a short versus a longer email makes a slightly difference, but there is no statistical significant difference between these four types of emails, even though like homosexuals receive a slightly lower answer. So the answer rates for homosexuals are lower than for heterosexual couples. So I'm going to go quick over these results. As I said, even with any sort of controls or control for property fixed effects, we have basically very stable results, also with different specifications, and they're more linear probability models, logics of probability models. So we have very stable results. Also, the baseline results show no statistical significant difference or no discrimination in any of these outcome variables. Answer, invite, number of characters, and insisting is a bit different. So we see, which is kind of interesting for gay couples, we observe a little bit higher insisting rates, and so some sort of a positive discrimination here. But when we actually divide our analysis by looking at below median range and above median range, we observe what I think is kind of interesting results and pointed out, and I would like to open the discussion to that. So for below median range, so the cheaper range, we observe negative discrimination towards homosexual couples in answers, invitations, and number of characters, even though it's not so significant, and again, insisting was positive. But if you look above median range, so more expensive houses and apartments, we observe positive discrimination. So here we see some positive discrimination to her. So gay couples get more answers, get also more invites, even though this is not statistical significant, but the number of characters is also significantly different and more than for non-gay couples, heterosexual couples. So that's why we really think, and align with what John have asked, it's very important to know some more characteristics about these landlords, and also what has been happening in in terms of the history of let's say maintenance of the apartments, paying their rents and time, and especially between these two type of groups, cheaper rents and more expensive rents. We do believe that there might be a correlation with the education levels. There might be some indication that landlords with cheaper apartments, they have probably a lower education level, and there is more poor discrimination, and indication of poor discrimination there. There is also this sort of belief that homosexual couples maintain their apartments very nicely in terms of design and the normal maintenance. So that may affect also more the above median rents or more expensive apartments. So this is all these aspects that we want to explore, as well some other interactions with some other variables of interest. Till so far we are focusing on, let's say, Portuguese names, which is very interesting to observe, is also the interaction with foreign couples. especially because this increase in rentals to foreign people in Lisbon, especially in big cities, and whether the discrimination works as the same or differently to hard foreigners. So some mechanisms and next step demand doesn't not explain why we have positive discriminations on the demand side for more expensive apartments. As I said, landlords are probably different. We may have a selection here for cheaper versus more expensive apartments. We hope to have a survey using a mobile phone asking for education levels at least. Landlords might not be so different, but they have different beliefs regarding the quality of the gay couples depending on their income. So we are planning also to conduct some lab experiments also associated with more a discrete choice experiment where we try to infer about preferences of say measuring different types of preference in terms of tenants for different from different landlords. Also, we have been talking about a possible intervention experiment with ILGA Portugal that is defending LGBT rights, and see whether we can have a more causal effect results. Okay, that's all. I didn't want to take so much of your time, and hope I get some questions from you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sandra. That was awesome. So you mentioned that there's a ban right now on like Airbnb and different sort of platforms. So is the research going forward going to focus just on like normal renting, or are you going to try and like what's happening on the policy response right now to enable you to do this research going forward?
Well, so João actually, he has a paper with some other co-author. He has a paper where he talked about this impact of this ban on posting houses on hosting platforms like Airbnb on housing prices. And there is some indication that actually there is an effect on housing prices. There is not so much, we don't know so much about the rental prices, but what we have been observing, have been collecting some more informal data because each, let's say, each real agent state has their own data, and I have been having some talks and they're trying to collect the data from different agencies. And what is happening by just looking at this data is there is people that are turning, so there is two things happening. People that are they wanted to post their houses on these platforms, but they have been deciding to sell them, or looking for long-term rents. The problem is there is still very much, let's say, a dislike, I would even say a kind of an aversion, a strong aversion against long-term rents in Portugal because of this sort of controlled market. So the market is liberalized, the rents are very attractive and very high, but there is still, especially among the oldest landlords, they are afraid of long-term rentings. There is now programs like incentive programs from governments to try to increase long-term rents, but there is lots of aversion and differences across different types of landlords because of these control rents. Control rents, as I mentioned, you may have very, very cheap rents, and there is always this kind of let's say people being scared that it is hard to once you do a more long-term rent to put your tenants out. So the impact has been more on, let's say, housing market, like for sale market, than actually for rents, but we will see. I believe there is by talking also to some real agents, what they told me was actually they feel that people that had houses on these platforms or actually wanted to have their houses on online platforms for Airbnb, for instance, they were more open. And they expect that if these houses enter the rental market, there will be less discrimination, any sort of discrimination. But it is not clear to me because your behavior as landlord changes as well. So the type of house and the type of market you are in. So that's the kind of an expectation real agents have, that they are more open and there will be less discrimination. But it's, we don't know. In terms of the number of the houses for the rental market, not as much as, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Sandra. Thank you.
So I have one observation and one question for the entire panel. And so maybe you can, the observation might require a comment. So when I look at this literature, you can go back to 1970. That's when Jowl and Prescott did their original work. And then maybe 20 years ago, it was rediscovered in an AER paper. The audit study methodology was rediscovered. But by and large, beyond the object of what you're measuring, this literature is essentially doing exactly what Jowl and Prescott did in their 1970 paper. It was published in a magazine called Race. Basically sending out resumes or CVs or emails and changing 2 or 3 different objects in that message. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a necessary condition. We need to start with measurement. But it feels to me as though beyond this last presentation, and this is a comment on the entire literature, which I consider myself part of, I don't think we take seriously enough the economics or the theory behind these mechanisms that are happening. And I say that because the solution to them, you can measure, I think there's discrimination everywhere. I've written in my own papers, discrimination is ubiquitous. We know that. And we could probably pretty much guess which direction it's going to go most of the time. But then I think you should ask yourself, okay, so what? What do we do? And to me, the type of discrimination or the underlying mechanism itself gives you the indication of how you should be tackling it. If it's taste-based, there's one kind of solution. If it's statistical, there's another kind. If it's a mixture, a lot of times, I know that we usually are polar with the theories, but it'll be a mixture. Then there might be something in between or some combination. But it feels to me the literature is still about that necessary condition, which I'm not criticizing, I'm saying I get that, but I asked the same question to each person at the beginning, and a lot of it, you were exceptionally honest, which I really appreciate. Like, I don't know, maybe. But I really think that the sufficient condition, if you think about this in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, you would say we need to measure, but then we need to know the mechanism, because that's going to lead to the policy action. And it feels like that part is still just like it was back in 1970. I think we've refined the message space a little bit, but we have not refined the theory test, even though the theory is kind of simple theory in terms of what the models look like. The behavior is pretty complex, but the theory is sort of simple ideas. Now, so I want you to comment on that, but my question, first of all, I guess my question in that first stage is, do you agree with me? And if not, tell me I'm wrong. My second question is, when I was listening to Sandra, what you have is a market that is a rental market that's fed by other types of markets. So I was thinking, okay, if there's discrimination in the labor market, yes, there's this connected market called the rental market, where there probably will be discrimination there too, if there's discrimination on the top side. And the reason why is because of like income effects or wealth effects, or maybe correlated preferences if it's taste-based. So my question is, do you know of papers or a literature that talks about connected markets and does, like this is an easy case. The labor market has discrimination. It's likely that the rental market will as well. Even if the labor market has taste-based discrimination, the rental market might have then statistical discrimination because of what's happening in the labor market. Could be totally different entrepreneurs, but their understanding the economics of it is caused upstream by the labor market. So I was wondering what the state of affairs is right now in the literature on connected markets, and how we can say, even if you have bigots in one market, that might cause people to look like bigots in another if we can't parse the kind of discrimination that we're observing. So I'll stop there. I've talked a lot. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two issues, the panel.
I'm not sure who wants to, I can jump in. I'm not sure who wants to go first. Really quickly, so I can leave time for others to answer this question. I think that's completely right. I think that, and this is your comments about how the literature needs to move into testing mechanisms of discrimination to inform the response. That's something that's echoed in your paper, papers by Marianne Bertrand, papers by David Newmark that kind of talk about like how this literature can move forward. We're doing that in some of these projects, and other people have been doing some testing of how much of discrimination is taste-based or statistical. It can be difficult to fully account for that. So for example, a test or statistical discrimination, you have to have something baked into your audit study where you change signals like creditworthiness signals or SCS signals or something like that. And in some of our cases, we can do that, but it's not perfect. So there are some frustrations there. I think we've made some improvements, but I think more improvements need to be made to try to sort of do this better. Where I think one way the literature is evolving in terms of getting at least gradually better at this too, is also using the audit framework to study other sort of policy changes. For example, so there's the Agan and Starr paper on ban the box where they do a diff and diff with an audit field experiment. So I don't want to take a tangent too much, but I think that's another way that the literature is evolving.
Yeah, I can push on Patrick's last comment too. I think I think you're right. I think that exploring the theoretical mechanisms can be particularly helpful in informing some types of interventions. I don't think, given the interconnectedness of statistical and taste-based discrimination, they're often thought of in the economics literature as two, at least I'm not an economist, so a non-economist talking about economic theory, they're often these polar theories apart, and there's clearly I always think that there's prejudicial underpinnings of believing certain market signals or thinking about ways of viewing and internalizing various market signals. So I don't think that it's ever as clean. And so we're able to test to some extent statistical discrimination, as Patrick said, by varying some type of credit worthiness signal or some type of credit worthiness signal, but it's often interesting how varying one type of signal when you're, say, including both race and gender or race and sexual orientation signals, there's a certain interplay of various signals in terms of racial identity formation and gender identity and sort of racial perceptions and gender perceptions that I think sociology can particularly inform much better. So I think increasingly there's a willingness in the economics literature to acknowledge the contributions of sociologists. And there was a recent paper by Deva Pager. It was in the Journal of Economic Literature that I would encourage people to read if they haven't, or Economic Perspectives, Journal of Economic Perspectives, I think. So I don't think I'm just talking at this point, John, to not actually answer your question, but I think that it's worth continuing to pursue. I don't know to what extent the audit methodology will ever be able to do more than better refine the signals we do provide so that we're getting clear SES signals with certain names to provide sort of better identification from that standpoint, as well as varying SES signals that are embedded in both names, as well as more objective SES signals to really parse statistical relative to other forms of discrimination. That's probably the frontier on that. But I think Patrick is right in that recent papers have used the audit methodology framework to assess the impacts of interventions. And I think one particular pathway forward is to use RCT frameworks in conjunction with audit frameworks. So imposing some type of intervention within the market. And there, I think you can use the theory-informed literature to think about how you design those interventions, but you can also take a somewhat more atheoretical perspective and just vary interventions. Well, probably a kitchen sink approach first. Does something work? Then vary interventions, and that might, in a sort of post hoc way, might inform theory. So someone much smarter than me might be able to do it in a much better way. But I think that that's sort of the next frontier that should be tackled, that can be tackled.
Yeah. And I think I just want to add something. I think we have been focusing too much on this statistical discrimination. Has been differences in expectations about the mean of unobservables, conditional what they observe, but it's not only about the mean, yes, like, and dealing also about the variance. It gets it difficult because we need not to just vary the levels of the characteristics in these emails, but try to create much more differences in these signals. I think it's kind of difficult to account for the variance on observables, but I think it's important to do that. And as John said, for policy purpose is really extremely necessary, even though both types of discrimination are illegal in most places. I think it's and about the connected markets, I'm not so sure. I have been talking actually with some more related to lab experiments doing that with some other co-authors and colleagues, that they are trying to work on this sort of connected markets in an impact of one market on the other, and this sort of discrimination, and but all in more lab type of environment and not yet, as far as I know, I don't know any of field experiment that do that.
Okay, thanks all three of you for answering. Yeah, the way I was thinking about it was that might be a useful instrument when you have spatial differences in labor market discrimination. Mm-hmm. That might be a useful natural instrument for discrimination in downstream markets that might be affected by the labor market. Yeah. Whether sharing entrepreneurs or just from an economic shock type argument.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, thanks for your responses.
And sure, I think, sorry, John, just one, I think it should be quite interesting to explore, especially in countries like in Portugal. There is lots of people that have small businesses at the same time. So they are in the labor market, they are hiring, but at the same time they are in a real estate. And
exactly.
I think and small landlords. Yeah. And I feel like there is quite some potential there to do this sort of connected market experiments.
Yeah. Rob, I've talked a lot. You can take it from here. I'll mute.
No worries. Patrick, David, Sandra, thank you so much for your super interesting talks today. I think this is obviously a large ongoing field that's very important, and I think we'll see more research. So looking forward to seeing more of it. And thank you for the co-authors in answering the questions in the Q&A, and thank you to the audience in asking all these questions. Very helpful for John and I anyway, and hopefully the co-authors to go through. Next week we're taking a break, and the week after we'll have Chris Knittel from MIT giving a talk. I'm not too sure on what yet, but we'll get there. So thank you all for sticking around for 90 minutes today, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. So thanks everyone, and take care.
And be safe, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Sandra, David, Patrick, thank you. You guys were great.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye.